say, even though he asked me to make it a long speech, because then he hasn't got to talk so long himself, I am going to hand you over now. So thank you very much tonight to TJ Johnson, who's now going to talk to you about recognition in modern media, and just to mention that copies of the book will be available to buy after the event. So over to you, TJ. Thank you.
Okay, is this on? Yep, everyone here. So, originally I wrote this book in 2021, and it started out more as a brief idea than an actual thing, and something that I had published on just the internet as about a 2-page document. It then, during COVID, came into a huge book now, and it was more that my friend said, you want to write an essay, but an essay is more, well, it comes from the French essai, which means an attempt to. It's not actually meant to change the world, it's not meant to groundbreak anything, it's meant to give a little nugget of insight and an attempt to direct something. And so I began with this idea and expanding it. The main principle is why we write. Why we write, why we want to be in books, why we immerse ourselves in books, and what is well-written literature. Now, granted, I am not the most smart person to be talking about what well-written literature is, but I do have a good insight on what well-written literature is, and that is what in the book is what is in there, sorry. And so, from why we write in the first place is, well, Aristotle would say that you should not write, because writing is, you are then making it so that you need to forget something when it's written down. You no longer need to remember it. But the problem then is, how will we know what he said thousands of years in the future? So whether it's by a scribe or by your own hand, things must be written down, in my opinion. And so now onto the question of what well-written literature is. Again, it does not need to be groundbreaking. It does not need to be these huge overarching thing. It just needs to be a little nugget of insight, something that is unique to you, something that is something you want to say on a subject or something else. So when starting this book in 2022, actually starting the main bulk of the book, I gathered a bunch of people together from the college that I was at, and I took the cover off the book. I gave it them just as a pure text script, and I asked them to read it. Gave them about 2 weeks for this, and this was one of the tests that I wanted to do with them, because something that is well written should traverse, even if you don't know the author. Let's say it was Stephen King and you like Stephen King books, then if it's not a well-written piece of literature, but you like Stephen King's other writings, you might be looking on it in a biased perspective. So I gave them some modern books, some classical books, and some just general books that they may have never heard of. One of those from very small publishers. And I asked them to come back with, and it gave mixed perspectives on it. Some people, in what they wrote down, said I instantly knew the writing style. And that indicated well-written literature, in that you know the style, you know who it was, how they wrote it, and you were immersed. Then one of the second questions I asked them was, how far did you get into it before you started losing interest? In some of the cases, and surprisingly for some of the modern pieces, people stayed the whole way through. And this also indicated what well-written literature was. So But there was very, very little in these pieces that people did not like. Things that I would say is, vanity publishers, I'd say this was like a vanity writer per se. And in recognition in modern media, I call these profit writers. People who purely write for profit. They churn out a book in 2 months or so on the latest whatever fad it is. And that is a profit writer. And they will only write for profit, they only have that in mind, and they try to encapsulate as many broad perspectives to sell as many books as possible. And then they write another book, and by 1 year they've written 20 somewhat good books. And thankfully, when I sent those out without the author's name or the author or the book title, about 70% of people came back saying that they did not like it. But then when I gave another group of people the actual book with the cover and the author's name, they liked it. Now, this could be a multitude of reasons. Looking at it scientifically, it could be that I just chose a group of 10 people that don't like modern literature and 10 people that do. So I have to take that into factor. But really, out of 10 and 10, so profit writers only write for this. And then we have the problem of profit publishers. These, more accurately known, are vanity publishers. They will pick up these books that are somewhat half-written. They will then publish them, and frankly, I view these as the main cause for the reason why people do not like to read. Because if a child is screaming and it's being really annoying, running about, throwing books off the shelves, etc., in a quiet place, you would not really blame the child, you would blame the parent. And that is exactly how I view this, in that the writer has the freedom to write whatever they want. They can do that. But it is the actual publishers that send it out into the world. They decide that. And there are so many publishers out there, I will not name which ones, but they go through books. They say what their niche is, and they go through them and choose the best, as well as some others, but mostly the best. But then there are that will just pick up anything and publish it without care for their reputation, without care for what they are sending out there. And this might seem like a very strong point to make, because all literature is worth reading, it's worth being sent out there. But a book is much more than folds of paper in binding. There are some books out there that have started wars. There have some that have caused fatwas to begin. There are ones that broke down the Romanov family, all right? So there's a lot that a book can do. It's quite a powerful instrument. And so knowing what to put out there is quite a difficult skill. Now, nowadays, we do not have to focus so much on the political aspect of books, but still, you are when these people are writing, they are contributing to this amalgamation of books which are put, and they can have effects on the world. Most recently, I forget her name now, but some of her books have caused rallies. Not in an aggressive stance, they are peaceful rallies for trans rights, because the book talks about these rights. Now that is extremely good. It's brought light to people that would not have known it, and now there is a movement of, I think last I read on the news, it was about 400 people in a rally, peacefully, just spreading the word about trans rights in London and New York. So the actual part of a book is very important. Then, just look at my notes. Then we get to the problem, which is, how do we know what well-written literature is, in my opinion, and the majority opinion from these people that I interviewed and the people that took part in this little test where I gave them books. Well-written literature is something that, again, is unique to a person. You would be able to read it, understand it, and gain some insight from it. So, even if it's very minimal, because when I say people gain insight from a book, they think I say read non-fiction. No, in most fiction, even if it's one or two things about a certain organisation, a certain ethic, a certain viewpoint, you will have learned something from it. But sometimes you will read a book, put it down and realise that it was bland, devoid of colour, the characters were 2D, the world, no matter how hard, a week later you cannot remember it. I think we've all been there with a book. And that is no fault of the author themselves, because they had an idea, they had a vision of what they wanted to do, but because they were sullied by the profit of it, and they have sat down and said, I can make a lot of money from books, that was what they had in mind the whole way through. So it has become, well, watered down and not really a book per se anymore, but just paper. What we then have is, then what happens is the market is being flooded with books that are these profit books, and it more or less is taking away from what a book actually is. It's a good, when you read it, you are immersed for a while, it works as a book should, but then nothing is gained, nothing is lost except your time. And Schopenhauer talked a lot about this. If you want to learn more, and further reading on this, read Schopenhauer's Essays and Aphorisms. It's an insanely good collection of essays and some aphorisms that were not long enough to be published as own books, but were published at times in magazines and publications as part of groups. In the section on good writing, he does speak very strongly about how money can sully the mind in writing. Now, of course, annoyingly, money is needed to feed families, pay the bills, and so it is needed. But it should not be the key aim from a book. The key aim from a book is to share your idea, to share whatever it is, whether it be a fictional land or an essay. So he very nicely in that he does state a Spanish verse, which I do not know Spanish, I cannot remember it in Spanish, but it translates to honor and money do not belong in the same purse. In that your honor and the money, you should hold one in one and the other in another. They should not coincide. Then he talks about what is good writing. Now, nothing is original. This is something that really annoys me, is that nothing is original. I always think back to the old, that Harry Potter is just a worse version of Star Wars because it doesn't have guns. All right, an orphan child raised by his uncle learns out he's got some special power, and so you see what I mean? There is no real originality in things. But if it is different enough that it can, when you think about these two keys of Star Wars versus Harry Potter, we know they are two different worlds. That makes them somewhat original in their own right. Schopenhauer also states that the only thing worth writing is what you have thought yourself, not the amalgamation of ideas by other people. And this is where I sort of disagree with him, in that he says you should not really read, as it deludes your mind and you are only then going to write what other people have thought. Of course, reading is a lovely pastime. It helps you gain knowledge on different words. It helps you gain knowledge on different structures, different viewpoints, different countries, even how they live in different countries. So I think reading is needed, but I do agree with what he says in that what you should write should be what you have thought. So when you are writing, and this is another problem of a writer if we've ever been there, is showing too much of yourself. And that is one of the main problems. So when being a writer, you do have to show a lot more than what you're comfortable with. You have to basically, as Neil Gaiman puts it, walk down the street, rip your shirt off and shout whatever's on your mind. That is what he says writing is. Because you do have to show a lot more than what you're comfortable with. And so you do have to root back in your mind for little nuggets of inspiration. But at least then, when people are reading whatever world you've created, they will be able to think back to either a word, phrase, character, environment, and know that it is your world. And that is well-written literature, in that it does not have to be original. It could be set in a wood, in a cabin, whatever. But when people then see that, think about it, they know it is your world and not some other thing. They're not getting it mixed up with another world that somebody else has created, and they can't really think whose is whose. So on that, he also talks about why we write, and it is that want to be seen, remembered, to be immortalized in a way in a book, to be known. And he does state that, again, the key aim of a book is to share knowledge, not to gain from it. So you should be wanting to gain minimal profit from it from the outset, and not really be thinking about that on the way. You should write because you want to write. And he talks mostly about different types of writers. He says, firstly, there is the writer who thinks while writing. That is the way he puts it. Thinks while writing. He thinks what he can put in there while he's doing it. So apparently to him, that is the most common form of writer. Frankly, I believe that type of writer is dying out, thankfully, and we are seeing an emergence in competent writers per se. But he says these are the most common, but this was written in 1890, so take it with a grain of salt. Then he speaks about people that think just before writing, in that they have thought what they want, know what they want, and have written it. but they also think somewhat while writing because they do not know the entirety of what they want to write. Then there are the people who think extensively before writing. The people that understand and know exactly what they want to write, how they want to write it. They basically have bulletin boards full of ideas and they know exactly how to write it. According to him, these are the most proficient writers, the best writers, as what they write will flow. What they write is understood, and if it's understood by them, it can be understood by other people. And if it can be understood extensively by them, it can be understood extensively by other people. So, enough about Schopenhauer and more about this book, my book. When I was writing it, I was struck with a few problems along the way. Mostly in that I did feel somewhat like a fraud per se, a bit of imposter syndrome, nothing uncommon between writers, because I was writing a book about the decline of books. It seemed a bit ironic, and it still is to me, and yeah. The annoyance also came in that when I sell the book, people say I am a hypocrite. No, because I sell it for very minimal profit, barely enough to cover the charges of getting here and going back. So I do believe that it is a well-written book, in my opinion, but that is another thing that I speak about in here, and that is whether it is a well-written book or not, it is not up for me to decide. It is up for the general public to decide. The people who read it, the people who are seeing this for the first time with an unbiased mind on who I am, they are the people that will think or discover whether it is well written or not. This caused, even though starting it in 21, the first draft was finished in 2022. I had to take a lot of breaks between. It was then published on the 10th of December 2023. So 2 years working on a 90-page essay. It meant that I had to take a lot of breaks between, because when I found myself starting to begin to write just for the sake of writing extra words, I realised that was going against my own ethic of what I had previously written, and so I would stop. I would then go back about a month or so later, when I then realised that I wanted to write. I had new ideas that I'd come up with, and I needed to write them down. So it took a long time to write this book. Despite it only being about 25,000 words, it took a long time to write. Purely because of that, I had to take breaks between. Also, I was still in college at the time, so I could only really write before and after and some during. Then, when publishing, I came to another halt of whether to go traditional or self. And I chose to go self because, and I understand previously that I said that there are publishers out there that will pick up practically anything. And annoyingly, Ingram Spark is one of them. But the difference is that whereas the publishers that I'm talking about that choose to pick anything are traditional, they will pick it up and print them in sets, in batches, and ship them out. Whereas at least on Ingram Spark and other print-on-demand services, it is print-on-demand. people will pick it up because they are interested in reading said book. They pick it up because they are interested in that. It's not really due to hype around the book, because heaven knows it barely sells about 5 copies a month. So and that I'm quite pleased on, in that it sells very minimally, in that it is people who do not know me, people that are looking for books on this subject and pick that. Then they read it without knowing me and then leave reviews, which I like, being 4 stars. I do not really focus in on the 5-star reviews because nothing is perfect. But about 4 and 5-star reviews, mostly, which is what I like to see. So, one of the main problems with being an academic writer is you're basically a lawyer, in that you are a lawyer and the entire world is a jury. It is impossible to write an airtight, just essay. You cannot please everyone in the world, and that was something I had to learn along the way of writing, because some of the earlier drafts were, I would make a point and then say, but also, and if you look at it from this perspective, and I would look at it from every side, and I would take up about 20 pages on one point, and I had about 1,000 other points to get through. So I had to mostly talk from the perspective that I was talking from, and then look at it from the exact opposite side, and then a middle point. And that was how I wrote the sections in this book. I spoke about it on my side, from the exact opposite, and then the midpoint. And if any of you are out there writing for university or something, trust me, that a piece of advice will make your life so much easier. Try not to please everybody in writing. When writing fiction, which I have done in the past, and I'm working on a fiction book right now, it's also true in that you cannot please everybody, so do not try to. It's quite evident to see when somebody tries to do too much in writing. They will talk from every angle, introduce characters from practically everything. People that would never be friends in real life would be sworn enemies, but they make them friends in this, and it seems really unnatural. And that is one of the problems of a new writer, is they do too much in one book. So, getting into some of my last points. Getting on to some of my last points. The main crux of this book was that it was really, really odd to write, because I'd never done something like this before. It took a lot of attempts, heaven knows. It took a lot of scraps of paper, then ripping them out and redoing. The other parts of this is basically what was the best from it all. And it works mostly in 4 parts. Now, one of the other main parts that I wish to talk about, have any of you heard about a news presenter called Gene Shepherd? He was in New York in the late 60s, early 70s, and he ran a late night show. The late night show was mostly for factory workers, people that just worked late. And he got annoyed with these types of books that people read because they are told to read them, people that read books that are not well written. And so he said one night on his show, go into a bookstore when you finish work in the morning, go into a bookstore and ask for a book called I Libertine. And he chose that name because it sounded the most pretentious. It sounded like a real book, sounded like something real, and he said, just do that. Go to a bookstore in the morning and ask for it. So somebody would go in, ask for, have you got I Libertine? And they would say, no. Another person would walk in, have you got I Libertine? No. And then they would see this pattern emerging, and they would phone the distributor, who would then say, we've never heard of that book, can we get it in? The distributor would then phone many publishers, saying, the publisher would say, we haven't got this. And then he paid somebody in the New York Times to put it on the bestseller list. Not high up, only somewhere in about the mid-range, somewhere where people would just scan over it, but it would be there. And then all of these things started emerging of newspaper articles saying, we've spoke to Mr. Ewing, who was the fake publisher of this book, the fake author. I spoke to Mr. Ewing and he's a nice guy. And another news article saying, we spoke to his wife, apparently they're in Sussex, completely made up. And then people would start talking about the book. They would then say it in book clubs. And one of the most hilarious parts of Jean Shepherd was he said, I actually met somebody who said they'd read it in their book club and they disliked it. So he let this go on for about 6 months, and then when it started petering out, he went on day radio on one of them, I forget the name of it, it's one of the most popular at the time news broadcasters in New York in the 70s, and he just said, the book does not exist. It has never existed. You cannot buy it. Anyone that said they've read it is a liar. Anyone that says they've interviewed Mr. Ewing is a liar. There is not a house in Sussex that he lives in. Everyone is lying. And it was one of these collective lies. He said, I'm getting annoyed at people reading books because they're on a bestseller list. You should be reading the books that you enjoy. If you read fantasy, you should read fantasy because you like it. You should pick it up for what the book is, not because a newspaper has told you to. And go online, I think it's on YouTube. He's Jean Shepherd. I don't know if he's gone now, but he'd be into his 90s. But about 10 years ago, he did an interview where he spoke about his time with this. If you go online now, there is a book called I Libertine, because somebody was so encapsulated by what the actual fake plot of the story was. They wrote the book. So you can actually buy it now. The story, he wanted it to be as pretentious as possible. So it was the story of a man living at the fall of the Romanov Empire, fighting in one of the wars, never named which war, but just one of them. And he then leaves, goes AWOL, and basically travels Russia. That was the pretentious plot of this book. It seemed a book that was real, was not. So Jean Shepherd is a key part in this. I speak about him in the third part of the book. The second part, going back slightly to the second part of the book, I talk mostly about the vanity publishers, the what I call parents of the publishing world, because again, if there is a screaming child, you do not really blame the child. It's being a child, you blame the parent. So that's mostly the second part. Then, sorry, I just cut that. Then, finally, just before questions, what then the terrible part was finding an ending to this. Because I had about, pages upon pages upon pages of ideas of what to write about, and if I were to write all about it, the book would probably be about the height of this table. So I couldn't do that for obvious reasons. So the problem I found was the ending. There were about 10 to 15 different endings that I wrote. If you look in the original manuscript, which I write everything by pen and paper, mostly because writing by pen and paper is less distractions. If I'm writing on a computer, I will not only find myself just standing there or sitting there, even looking at the screen, nothing will flow through. Nothing will pop into my head. I will not be able to write on a computer. But also, because of that, the whole I am unable to write on a computer, I would then be tempted to Google things to write about. So I write everything by pen and paper because I can take it anywhere with me. I can just write anywhere, and it's way less distractions. If you look in the original manuscript, there is about that thick in the notebook, ending 1, and it just goes through the ending, and then ending 2, and it goes through the ending. And it went on, and I was never happy with any of them. And it is quite a hard thing to round off something in a satisfying manner, because there is nothing worse than putting a book down, saying, oh, that was good, but the ending not being satisfactory, not giving you closure, per se, in what the book had. So the ending was quite a tough part to write, because I still, even to this day, feel like I could have said a lot more. And the annoying part was about 2 months after I published it, I was out with a friend, and we were just chatting, and he made a point about writing, which I've never thought of. And I said, where were you 2 months ago? I could have added that in. And annoyingly, Aristotle was right, because I wrote that down and now I can't remember it. So that was the main part of that. That's what I've got on my sheets now. Open up the floor to questions. Yeah.
So you consider for-profit writers who write things that are largely unoriginal and specifically to gain money. So would you then consider Shakespeare a for-profit writer? Because his works were largely based on pre-existing literature. They were specifically to make money, and yet he's regarded as one of the greats. So when does it become a for-profit writer, or is it just that it was modern and you didn't like it?
That is something...
I intended, sorry.
No, don't worry, please. Please, shout at me, do whatever you want. It's nice when a debate like this goes forward. What happens is, that is exactly one of the points that I try to make in this, is that people view classical literature as better because it is classical. That's not the case, as you've pointed out. Just because it's classical does not mean it's good, all right? There is a book by Nikolai Gogol, which is called Dead Souls, considered one of the great books of classical Russian literature. Frankly, I think it makes a semi-decent good point about the state of the Russian economy, but apart from that, it's not a very, very good book. So yeah, I completely agree with you there. And Shakespeare, to be honest, I don't really like his work. And I completely agree with what you've said. Yeah. Controversial, yes.
That is controversial, indeed.
I don't really like it, yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah, so and it's not because I found it difficult. I just didn't really like it. And again, as you've pointed out, it was mostly on pre-existing, and that's one of the problems. Is people then he took these people's work. He became more famous, and if you ask somebody, do you know any other about 15 to 1600s writers? No, they don't. Even though there were thousands of plays being put on, because that was really the renaissance of plays and spoken word poetry. People don't really know about those other people than Shakespeare. So I completely agree with you there, and that is one of the points I'm making here, that just because it's old does not instantly mean it's good, and just because it's modern does not instantly mean it's bad. So, yeah, any others?
I would just like to suggest that Shakespeare is good for reasons other than being old.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's a lot of structure and
Yeah.
genius in that work.
But it also
Whether you like it or not, it doesn't have to be to everyone's
Dare I
taste.
add that I did say I mostly don't like his work.
Yeah.
Mostly.
But it also suggests that if he is one of the only writers' works
Yes.
who actively persevered and has still been put on alongside your Marlowes, etc. But even then, Marlowe is a lot less well known, so it suggests that there was something about Shakespeare, despite his lack of originality and prophet writing, that made him a cut above the rest. So surely not all prophet writing is bad. Some of it, Charles Dickens is another good example of he wrote for profit. He was serialised. Arthur Conan Doyle. A lot of our great Victorian writers were writing for profit, and they wrote objectively good literature that has persevered, literature that touches people.
Yes.
None of them might enjoy it,
No.
but
Yes.
they will acknowledge it is good. Because the thing is, you raise 100 points, and I don't even know where to stop.
Yes.
Because having worked with books one way or another for the best part of 40 years, as you can imagine, I've got quite a lot of opinions of my own.
You've read quite a lot of books, haven't you?
Yeah. So I don't really know where to start with the points that you raised, but some really, really sort of interesting points. It's like this thing you said about, not everything that's old is good, not everything that's modern.
It's bad.
Oh, sorry, bad. It's bad.
Yeah.
But equally,
Not everything that's old is good,
Yes.
not everything is
And
modern
not
and
everything
bad.
that tops the bestseller charts is good
Yes.
either. In my opinion, obviously just because millions of people have read something doesn't mean it's good particularly. It's popular, it's enjoyable by that readership. But again, it kind of comes back to where sometimes I put away some of the slightly loftier ideas and opinions, because in our job, which is to get people into buildings like this and to borrow books and read, we really, well, I'll speak for myself here, I do not mind what people read, as long as they read.
Yeah.
That at the end of the
Yeah.
day is what I think. I might have lots of opinions over authors or genres I'm not over keen on. Occasionally I'll dip my toe into like the bestseller list just so I can sort of see what people are reading. And occasionally I really end up enjoying the book. Other times, things that have been top of the bestseller list for months and months and months, I finally get around to reading and I think, really? Case in hand, recently a book called Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow.
I've heard of that.
Again, huge sort of successful book, snowball sort of success as opposed to like being a big name author. It kind of was a word of mouth growth. And as I said, every now and again I will sort of dip my toe into that kind of pool and say, okay, let's have a look. And generally, it is rewarding. I enjoy these sort of.
I always try and approach books from an unbiased perspective,
Yes.
not really know. Like one of my friends, she said, "You have to read Perfume by Patrick Susskind. You have to read it. You have to read it." And she went on for ages, to the point of she actually sent me a copy. And I said, I will read it. I do not really know who Patrick Susskind is, apart from he is a German-born writer and he wrote this in about the 70s, early 80s. That is it. I then got round, she said it's one of the best books you'll ever read. I am now on page 70 and I've been on it for about 3 weeks, purely because I don't like it. Now again, that is purely my opinion on the book. I think it is well written in that it encapsulates you in the world. It's original, it gives a somewhat original point, I just don't enjoy it. And this is one of the problems that I try and issue in this, is there is a difference between what is objectively good and bad to personal opinion. And majority of what somebody has to say is personal opinion. And looking at this from a philosophical perspective, I think that's just what makes us human. It's nice. You know, if we were all the same, there would be one book in this whole place that, you know, that's it. So it is nice.
You think there's only one book.
Yes.
Just saying.
Yes.